And the matter is before the court today on plaintiff's motion for partial summary disposition pursuant to MCR 2.116C10 and attorney fees under the no-fault statute. So, as an initial matter, counsel, would you please place your appearances on the record?
Thank you, Your Honor. Aaron Wisely appearing on the behalf of Plaintiff Francine Seals.
Thank you.
Mark Wright Sr. appearing on behalf of Defendant National Interstate Insurance Company of Hawaii.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Wright. And a couple of the preliminary matters before we jump into the substantive part of the motion. There were evidentiary issues raised regarding a couple issues, and I wanted to get a sense. The first one was, Mr. Wright, kind of in passing in the brief, you mentioned spoliation of the evidence by disposal of the body here, which I assume was cremated or some such that prevented an autopsy. Well, what happened to the body that you couldn't conduct a kind of counter autopsy?
As far as I know, Mr. Seals was buried, and that's it. By the time the suit was filed, I think it had been almost a year, after his death.
So you could have dug him up, but you elected not to.
Well, I didn't know how much value digging it up might have been.
No, you never know until you dig it up. And I say that from firsthand knowledge, having dug up at least one plaintiff in my work history. So, not personally, I'll note it was done by others. All right, Mr. Wisely, response on spoliation.
The response on spoliation would be, first of all, I when I saw the footnote reference not once but twice, there was never. First of all, there was an autopsy performed by the only person who was allowed to perform an autopsy. The issue has never been raised during the pendency of this litigation until in the footnote in defendant's response. And my response to that would be that at the time Mr. Seals was buried and his remains disposed of, there was no reasonable expectation of any litigation at that point. Mrs. Seals' survivor's loss claim was not even opened by the defendant until 2.5 months post-accident. They never requested that the body be preserved at any point. That footnote in the response is the first mention ever of a claimed spoliation issue.
Your Honor, if I may respond.
Yep, go ahead.
Yeah, I put that in the footnote to essentially circumvent any argument that plaintiff might make at some later date, saying that, well, we never, Dr. Kaplan, for example, did not, inspect the body. And it's essentially saying that, kind of preserving that issue if it were to come up.
Sure. Well, and I will state for the record, I did have a case involving a med mal death where I did dig up the person a year after. As I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office defending one of our rural health clinics, and then had I did have a medical examiner, my contract, my expert employee, perform an autopsy. So to learn what we could, or at least exclude what I thought was a potential cause of death. So it can be done. Since it wasn't asked for here, I think the spoliation, it would ring a lot more true if you dug her up or dug him up and, deterioration or whatever had made it impossible to make the determinations. And, sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't. So, ours was, in our case, we could make that determination, and it was a good solid year later. And I recall talking to that pathologist, and I said, well, what could be kind of the worst case scenario where you can't do the autopsy? And she said, oh, if they're soaked in water, that's the worst. And the day of it, I called and I said, well, was there water? And she said, oh yeah, totally immersed in water. But she still managed to do the autopsy, which I can't even begin to imagine how disgusting it was, and reaffirmed my belief that I made the right choice by going to law school instead of medical school. So I'm going to deny, any sanction or discovery remedy on spoliation at the time, because I do believe, you'd have to pursue that autopsy further than simply saying, well, they're put in the ground, I couldn't do it. Sometimes you can, it all depends what your you're looking for. So